Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sarah Pollack and welcome to a very special, which I'm unbelievably excited about, the World War II nerd that I am, episode of Pioneers Talks. It's a huge honor for me that we can welcome Iain Standen, who's the CEO of Bletchley Park Trust, here with us in Prague, as a part of him also speaking at our conference. You'll probably be hearing this later because we're filming this actually on Armistice Day, on the 11th of the 11th. So it's very apt, I think. But Iain has very kindly accepted our invitation to come over to talk about Bletchley Park. And I think most importantly to talk about the kind of blend between humans and technology, and especially during times of crisis, how that symbiosis can be so helpful. Iain, welcome.
Thanks very much. Good to be here.
Thank you. Maybe just for the audience that is not such a nerd into the Second World War as I am, could you please give us a little bit of context about Bletchley Park and why it's so historically important, please?
Okay, so Bletchley Park was the home of the codebreakers during the Second World War. It was a place where the government code and cipher school, the UK's organisation for producing signals intelligence, was located. That organisation had started during the First World War. It was formally convened as the Code and Cipher School in 1919, and through the interwar period plied its trade out of London. But as the Second World War started to loom on the horizon, many people realised that being in a big city like London probably wasn't a good idea, and they started looking for what they termed war stations outside of London. And in 1938, Bletchley Park, a country estate near a little town of Bletchley, northwest of London, was identified as a possible location. And the head of SIS, who was the boss of this organisation at the time, bought this little country estate. And during the Munich crisis in late 1938, the Government Code and Cipher School decamped from London up there, thinking they might be going to war. Of course, Chamberlain comes back and says, "No, peace in our time, peace for our time," and they all sort of depart back to London. But war ensued a year later, and between sort of 38 and 39, as war became more and more inevitable, the site of Bletchley was expanded. Some early wartime huts were built. So when war starts in September 1939, all these folks come up and occupy this place. And then during the Second World War, they ply their trade. They produce fantastic intelligence that helps the Allies win the war. It doesn't win the war for them, but it certainly helps along the way. And the organisation grows from a couple hundred people at the start of the war to 9,000 at the height of the war.
It's a riveting story, and I think one of the most poignant but also probably best known characters, although there were other people of course contributing hugely, is Alan Turing, kind of this tragic hero of the whole story. What really fascinates me about it, of course, like massively popularized by the Imitation Game,
indeed,
but the actual pushback, the fact that this wasn't kind of conventional warfare, that it was more about having access to intelligence rather than having access to the better planes, to the better tanks. Was it difficult to kind of convince the top brass that actually investing into things like cryptography is super important in the war effort?
I think it was, having had success in the First World War, albeit limited, and the organisation continuing to do its business in the interwar period. The value of it was known, and the fact that they were able to bring people like Turing and other great brains from the universities into the organisation and expand when the war started was recognition that this work was needed. Of course, as the war progresses, there are all sorts of priorities for the finance and resources. So it was a battle to continue to get those. Of course, the most famous story is the visit by Churchill in 1941. He comes in September 1941, wanders around as prime ministers do, pats a few backs, shakes a few hands, and says, "You're all doing jolly well." And apocryphally leaves saying, "If you need anything, let me know." A month later, nothing's happened, and four of the senior code-breakers, including Alan Turing, write a very famous letter known in the sort of the Bletchley Park lexicon as the Wicked Uncle's letter, where they write to Churchill saying, "You visited, you said, if we need anything, well, here's what we actually need." They say that Mr. Travis, who's the number 2, has been working very hard, but without any, success to get these resources. So sort of, stabbing the boss in the back by not mentioning him. And the most junior one, a chap called Stuart Milner-Barry, is sent down to London with this letter. He gets to number 10, and a military staffer sort of takes the letter, gives it to Churchill, who writes on him, give them what they need with extreme priority and let me know when it's been done. And he puts one of his famous action this day, tabs on it, and that's it. The resources start to flow. So certainly at the top of the shop and other places, people recognised that the resources were needed. And the fact this place grows from a couple of hundred at the start of the war to 9,000 at the end of the war is recognition of how important the work was. And of course, success begets success. As they produce more and more valuable intelligence, the more people realise they actually need these resources.
Yes.
And so I think, yes, to go back to your kernel of your question, I think, there's a recognition that intelligence is a huge enabler. As I said earlier, intelligence doesn't win wars. Intelligence, though, allows the soldiers, sailors, and airmen prosecuting that war to have the best picture. And the classic example of that is D-Day, where the Allies knew where every one of the 58 German divisions were on the Atlantic Wall. They had, maps, they had photographs, they had all sorts of information allowed to create a rich picture, so that the soldiers going over the beach knew exactly what they were going to face. They still had to fight them, they still had to kill the Germans, but actually they knew where they were, what they were doing, what numbers they were, etc., etc. So I think, in the Second World War, most definitely the value of intelligence was very well understood.
Yes, and it's fascinating, and we were discussing this as we were preparing for the podcast, how the idea of reconnaissance and scaling that through technology during a time of crisis, during a time of war, is actually of vital importance. And even I reminisce about the start of the Ukraine conflict, when we put together a group of what were essentially ethical hackers, and basically we thought, well, yes, of course, the refugees, for example, need material help like sleeping bags and shelter and things, but they also need to not share their geolocation, and they need to make sure that they don't click on phishing scams. And it actually became much more of a digital war in some areas than a territorial war, which is really interesting how that kind of legacy has been constant basically since the Second World War. And I'm curious, my best friend is in the army. You're a military man yourself. How did you end up, you've been at Bletchley Park for 10 years now. What was your journey there, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, so prior to Bletchley, I spent 28 years in the army, doing a mixture of signals and intelligence and staff work and deployments overseas to places like Rwanda and Iraq and what have you. But it came to the point where I decided to leave the right side of 50 and was looking for another career. I'd spent most of my life being interested in history and heritage. It's sort of a passion, from being a sort of battlefield guide to just visiting, historic sites myself. And I think it probably always inspired to work in that field at some point. And it was one of those lucky happenstances that just as I was leaving, the job as CEO at Bletchley Park was coming up. I applied, it's the only job I applied for, and I got it. And, so coming up 10 and a half years later, I'm still here. It's a fascinating place to work, always a new challenge, and it's been a privilege and a pleasure to develop the site, the place, the offer, the museum over the course of the last 10 and a half years.
Yeah, it's just for you guys so that you have the context. I first had the pleasure of meeting Iain. I think it was back in 2018 when I was working in artificial intelligence and predicting visitation for museums and galleries, and I came to Bletchley, and for me that was a dream come true, like finally to visit the place. And I remember when we were talking back in the day that actually keeping a heritage site like that going and taking over and creating all the programs and exhibits is an incredibly challenging thing to do, both kind of economically, but also to make sure that the content it keeps staying fresh and kind of engaging to the public, which I think you've done an incredible job of. And I'm just curious, with COVID having happened between our meeting as well, how Bletchley Park has developed over that last decade.
So over the last decade, we've opened up a huge amount of the story. As you would have seen, the site, when the Bletchley Park Trust took it over sort of 30 years ago, was largely derelict. This is one of the downsides of being a top secret story. Nobody knows how important the site was. And for many years, it was underinvested. It was used by the government for all sorts of things post-war and gradually went into graceful decline just as the story was coming out. So when the trust took over 30 years ago, it inherited 26 acres of largely derelict buildings and has spent a long time to get them stabilised. Certainly in the last 10 years, we've really up the ante. We've managed to raise and invest about £27 million into the site, which means we've restored many of the buildings and populated now with the story. So from the pre-war Victorian mansion, which tells the story of the early occupation, through other buildings we tell the story of Alan Turing's bomb machine, we tell the story of the sort of the early wartime huts, through the expansion from sort of 42 to 45, when the site went from a couple of hundred to sort of about 800 or 900 to 9,000, through the landscape itself, where people had sort of love affairs and friendships and played a bit of sport and what have you. A whole panoply of the story, from the techie style, code-breaking stuff to just the people stories of living on the site. So we were heading on a very nice trajectory with all that, and then COVID hit. Prior to COVID, we were above 250,000 visitors a year. In fact, in 2019, 280,000 visitors. To then the COVID years were 100,000 visitors, and we're just sort of struggling back out. And as we discussed before this, we then get hit with the sucker punch of a war and an economic crisis. So it's been challenging times to get the public to come out and what have you. But I think gradually we'll get back up to that level. But it's been difficult.
Yeah, but you're pivoting a lot, given how many tough moments that Bletchley has endured in the last few years. One of the things that you were telling me about, which sounds superbly exciting, is the educational program. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I feel that when the public is educated and war does come or a crisis does come, you're always in a much more resilient position, because the people have just a better, fresher, more critical outlook on the information that they see around them, and they can kind of work with them evolutionarily a lot better. So what have you done in regards of the education? What can we expect?
Yeah, so like any museum, learning is at the heart of it. Whether it's informal education that your average visitor gets, nobody visits Bletchley Park without going away learning something more. And you spoke about the imitation game briefly earlier on. For many people, the imitation game is probably their first exposure to Bletchley Park. But actually what we do is take that kernel and unpack the proper story. So your average visitor arriving on a Saturday afternoon, spending 3 or 4 hours with us, will go away with an education. But we also have a formal learning program, which is where we offer schools, universities, colleges, whatever, the chance to come with groups of students and have a more hands-on, more interactive engagement. So for schools, we run Codes and Ciphers workshops, which is essentially maths by stealth, which is, maths is always a challenge at school, whichever era you're in. So it's great for the students to come. They do hands-on workshops, depending on what level they are in the school. They're more and more complex maths. And then, of course, they have the context of Bletchley Park and the story of there. And the story we tell for universities and schools is about challenge, overcoming, problem solving, those sort of things. So it's a much more deep engagement with the story. And it fulfills, of course, our charitable purpose of providing education for a whole range of audiences. Prior to the pandemic, we hosted about 30,000 visitors through that program a year. Pandemic, we had nothing. And what's been great is it's bounced back in 2022, and we're almost up to the same level we were in 2019. And as we discussed, we're in fact, in the process of converting some more buildings and building an auditorium, which means that once that's up and running, all being well, sort of end of the summer next year, we'll be able to host up to 50,000, probably beyond learners on an annual basis, and also have an auditorium where we can run academic symposia, our own public programme, and various other uses to maximise the space we have.
Because one of the things, and it's great that it's being so open to the public, because in the last 10 years, what was often reserved for scientists or like a very small technological elite, things like artificial intelligence and the importance of cybersecurity, that's really started touching the lives of ordinary people. Has there been an interest in these topics? Like, do people come to you for guidance?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the learning program, as well as the codes and ciphers workshops, we also have a cybersecurity module that schools will do. I should mention, in fact, we also have an outreach program, as well as those visits on site. We also have members of the team that go out to far-flung parts of the UK where it's just too difficult, journey time's too long for schools to come in, and they will go and locate themselves there and deliver stuff in the schools themselves. And as part of that, cybersecurity is an important one. Safety online really is what it's all about. But actually, as you say, in the last 10 years, it's become something that even school kids need to know about in some detail and have some skills. Perversely, of course, they probably have better skills at that than most of their parents. Yes. But it's something that we feel is a valuable program, and it's continuing to run as part of our core offering.
Yeah. Well,
I was going to say, pick up the AI piece. That's something that has always been in the back of the story. And when you go back to, Alan Turing and Turing test, Turing is very much part of our story and those sort of bits and pieces. And one of the innovations this year is to have a proper temporary exhibition space where we can bring in artifacts from other museums, so it's climate controlled and all the rest of it. Sort of a white space that you can make into whatever exhibition you want. We're currently running an exhibition about visualizing data, but the next iteration of that will be AI, because AI is so all pervading, as we were discussing earlier. Sometimes people don't realize it's there and it's doing stuff. Sometimes people are worried and scared about it, and what we want to do is sort of unpack a bit of that in our next exhibition, talk about some of the sort of the genesis of AI, going back to the Turing test, looking at the Asimov and his robots and the rules of robotics, looking at some of the ethical considerations, because I think it's an area that is starting to get into everybody's lives, and it's also an area where our visitors are going to have an interest. So yes, we want to continue to keep the Bletchley Park story fresh and alive.
Yes, and it's a really interesting kind of schizophrenia because one of the things that I love doing is demystifying artificial intelligence for the general public, and the Enigma story is very much what I often rooted in, because yes, on one hand you have constant new articles coming out every day about machine learning and AI getting better and better and better, and I think that that's what people are kind of scared of. They have this kind of fear of missing out, so they don't kind of get into the topic at all. But then when you look at the ancient Greek automata, or even the story of the Second World War and Turing, you see that the principles of automating essentially calculations has always kind of been there, and automating like the manual computation. Because you told me you're preparing this AI exhibit for 2025, so it's so difficult to kind of predict what's going to happen. But how are you kind of conceptualizing it? How do you want to take it on with the future so far?
So very, very early days is the first thing to say. We are having internal and external conversations about that, but it goes back to us just now. It's about, let's go back to basics. Let's like I said to you before, if you ask 20 people what AI is at the moment, I think you get 20 different definitions, and that is part of the problem. What do people mean by AI? So I think we're going to get back to the basics. What are the components? What is AI? What do we mean by AI in this exhibition? To set the pathway, then look at some of these seminal bits and pieces, whether it's Turing test, whether it's Asimov and his robots, and those sort of things, and then some of the ethical issues around it. And then undoubtedly there'll be some sexy bits of technology that we might want to be putting in there to give people an idea of how it's affecting their day-to-day lives. But as you said, a lot of it's about calculations. A lot of it's about just automating, shortening the process of doing things. And you use the example of the Second World War, whether it's Turing Welshman bomb helping resolve Enigma, where it's the Colossus computers, speeding up the process of breaking into the high-level Lorenz cipher. There are Bletchley Park examples we can use of that, and then there's there's probably some gazing into the future we might want to do, but again, I think anchored in the practical reality and anchored in the ethics, so people are not worried about it, not scared about it. It's just try and unpack it and make it accessible and understandable.
Yes, absolutely. And it's funny as well because we're now sitting in Prague and Czech Republic. One of the Czechs, whenever we have something to be proud about, we shout from the rooftops. And the word robot, as it happens, is Czech from the Rossum's Universal Robots. But I think unfortunately it's been one of the things that's been misunderstood as this kind of like half biological, half kind of like computer, or like the kind of computer equivalent of the human mind. And I think that's what kind of people from that kind of sci-fi aspect of it are kind of scared about. And even with Turing's work, he wrote a lot of seminal papers that sometimes I fear have been kind of misinterpreted a little bit. And for the audience who maybe doesn't know the story, it'd be great, because we mention him so many times, if you could tell us a little bit about Alan Turing's story in Bletchley Park and the cracking of the enigma, that would be fantastic.
So Turing was already a brain before Second World War. I think he wrote On Computable Numbers, which is his sort of paper in which he envisages as the universal, Turing machine, and basically what we would term today a PC that, you put a different program in, it can do a different task. And he writes that in 1936. Conceptually, hadn't any idea what it looked like and how it would work, but he came up with the concept. So he was already a brain. And therefore, when Alistair Denison, who was the head of the Government Code and Cipher School at the start of the war, in that late interwar period, in the sort of late 30s, decided that with war on the horizon, they needed to expand the brain power in the Code and Cipher School, went out and recruited a whole raft of people. Alan Turing was one of them. I mean, there's a fantastic list. We have a copy of it at Bletchley, but actually the real one sits in GCHQ, of all the people that Denison went to chat with, and many of them will appear at Bletchley Park. Turing, Welshman, and various others, including J.R.R. Tolkien, who didn't turn up. Never quite knows why he didn't turn up, but he did spend most of the war then writing Lord of the Rings, so perhaps he had a better offer.
Wow, I did not know this.
He's on the list. So anyway, we digress. We were getting back to
very exciting
to Alan Turing. So he's approached many of these chaps. He's sort of put on a retainer. He does some training courses prior to the start of the war, and then at the start of the war, he arrives along with all his colleagues from university and a small group of ladies who were recruited to do the administrative support as well. And he decides that he's going to tackle the Enigma challenge, and particularly then onto the naval Enigma, which is even more complicated than the ordinary Enigma. And he also comes up with the concept of the bomb machine, which is part of automating the code-breaking process. Now, credit where credit's due. Some of the early work on that was done by the Poles.
Marian Rejewski.
Rejewski and Zygalski and Rzyński, who, again, without digressing too much, the Poles had decided from the early 30s that Enigma, which was being used by the Germans, was their sort of challenge, and they create a cryptanalytical course at Poznan University. They train these guys and they work out how to break into Enigma using mathematical methods rather than the rather more traditional methods that the Brits were using. Anyway, cutting a long story short, just prior to the war, the Poles, with war literally looming on the horizon, share with the Brits what they've done, and part of that is they've come up with this concept of what they term a bomber, which is a machine to help break Enigma. They pass that across to Turing. Turing takes it. He works with a chap called Welshman, another one of these dons from Oxford, and they come up with the bomb machine, which people, if they've seen the Imitation Game, will see one off. There are ultimately a couple of hundred of those in the UK and same in America at the height of the war. They scale the whole process up. But Turing comes up with a concept, passes that concept across to the British Tabulating Machine Company at Letchworth, who turn concept into reality. And an often sort of unsung hero of the story is a chap called Doc Keane, who's the sort of engineer across there who takes Turing's ideas and turns them into a machine. But this machine, first one rolls out in January 1940, allows them to, using this sort of fast processing power to do all these calculations, test hypotheses, and speed up the process of breaking into Enigma. And having been a success, they then scale up, and say up to more than 200 machines in UK, and allows them to to break into numerous networks on a daily basis. And Turing is behind that, but come 1942, having sort of set all this stuff up, he seeks further challenges, and he goes and gets involved with other projects. He does some liaison work with Americans. He works at a place called Bletchley Park, dealing with voice encryption.
Mm-hmm. Oh wow!
Yeah. But so he's an important part of the early story. But I won't say he got bored, but having done the challenge and set things in train, he wants new intellectual challenges to do other bits and pieces.
And this voice encryption, I don't actually confess I don't know much about that.
It's a system called Delilah.
Uh-huh.
You're testing my knowledge now of Turing in detail, but I'm not sure it was ever put into full operational use. It was certainly, I think, capable of doing the job, but I'm not sure whether it was actually operationalized. But essentially secure encrypted voice.
Yeah, wow. It's really amazing, the parallels between kind of the uses of modern artificial intelligence, which is essentially machine learning for very specific tasks like voice recognition, computer vision, things like that. And the parallels are just striking. We just now also, what I feel that people kind of forget sometimes is that we now have the hardware, such as the graphic cards that can actually run this on the everyday computer, whereas before, you had to have a humongous machine just to process things like this. What was the breaking point and the breaking of the enigma as well? Because there were a couple of points like the repeated like weather reports and things like that.
I mean, the it comes back to the AI. Comes to your early example. It's people and machines. You put people in the loop. An enigma machine was essentially a reciprocal cipher. Two machines, either end of a link. If they're set up the same, you type in text one end, produces ciphertext. You put the ciphertext in the other end, it produces the plain text. Really simple stuff. And actually, if you don't put a man in the loop, it's probably very, very secure. But what happens is you put people in the loop, and they start to create flaws. So you spoke about weather report. Absolutely, is a sort of an example of where, for good reasons, the military use formatted messages. If you've got cold, wet soldiers, sailors and airmen sending messages, actually what you want them to do is just follow process. So if you're sending a weather report at a minute past midnight on a certain day, chances are the first line of text with the weather report for date is, and then you might say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. Well, whilst that helps the poor wet sailor send you the message, it also helps the cryptographers, because if they know they're listening to a weather station, and you find out the first time you break into it, that's how the message is formatted. Every day that that's the plain text which your ciphertext is matched to.
Yes.
Or if you have to send some random letters, but you decide rather than send random letters, you send your girlfriend's name. A bit like using your dog's name and your birthday as your password today. If you put the human in the loop, they will come up with a shortcut that makes it easy for them, but also makes it easy for somebody listening into the process.
Yes, exactly. Because this is again where historical parallels, and sorry, I'm just saturating my own curiosity talking to you right now. For example, when Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphics on the Rosetta Stone, again he was looking for repeating patterns, like with the cartouches of like Alexander and Cleopatra. The moment you get that, you can decipher the rest of the text. And one of the stories that I found fascinating in the Enigma story is that, for example, the soldiers were instructed to change the rotor settings every day. But if you're, as you say, exhausted in the field, tired, starving, the last thing that you're going to think about is meticulously changing the rotor settings, so you can massively cut down the number of combinations that you're basically dealing with.
Absolutely, yeah. Human error leads to taking things that are hugely difficult, suddenly reducing the probabilities down very, very rapidly.
Yes.
So if you put the man in the loop, they will cock it up, basically. And that's what the code breakers were Bletchley Park were relying on. Whilst they had the technology, you had to have a hunch right at the start.
Yes, yeah.
What they termed a crib, right at the start, which says, okay, we think these are the things that are going on. Let's test that. So what your bomb machine's in, testing a hypothesis, but a hypothesis based on knowing how people will work.
Yes.
And they had all sorts of what they termed cribs, depending on whether it was girlfriends' names or whether it was thinking that, as you said, somebody might have left the setting from the day before as it was rather than changing it. So just putting in human factors into things. And as I said, it's irrelevant today. If somebody's going to break your cipher, break your password.
Yes. Just like the wall behind us.
The first thing they're going to do is, do a bit of human analysis and, see when your birthday is. Go on your Facebook site, see your birthday is or whatever. What's your wife's name and your birthday, or if your dog's always featuring in your pictures on Facebook, then what's your dog's name? That's a good start point.
Yes.
So it's. Things don't change, technology does, but some of those underlying principles are always there.
Yeah, and this is one of the things where I guess as an archaeologist who works in AI, I'm maybe trying to justify my own existence, but the kind of need for multidisciplinarity in approaching technology is really important, because a hacker these days is nothing but a good psychologist as well, obviously as being a fantastic programmer. But it's amazing how you have to really understand the human condition and what the human is going to do with the computers. I was talking to a friend recently about the recommendation algorithms, for example, online that do track your behavior, and kind of when you think that Facebook is listening to you, well, it doesn't have to. You're leaving behind such a trail of breadcrumbs of geolocation, your friends, what you kind of send messages about, what you like, what you interact with, and then kind of like honing that down and recommending a particular ad, it becomes much easier. And it's just statistics and matching that basically with behavior. And I think once people kind of understand what really sits underneath the hood of artificial intelligence and machine learning, they can get much less scared of it as well.
Yeah, and some of that is probably good for you.
Yeah.
I think one has to, this is my opinion, you have to sort of break away security from some of the other aspects of this. People want things done quickly. They want recommendations, that's why people sign up to Mumsnet and and TripAdvisor and all the rest of it, because they want somebody to give them some hints. So if you like this, you might like that. The crossing of the line is making sure that you don't leave information in one area that might compromise your security in another area, and that's but again, that's the user. You've got to be clever about how you do stuff. If you don't want to get recommendations, you don't want to have things for you, then fine, you can leave nothing. But most people's lives are so busy today, they want recommendations. Just be careful you don't leave stuff that allows your security to be breached.
Exactly, the trade-off is worth it. Well,
it might not be worth it. It's up to you. But what you've got to be is a informed user.
Exactly. You have to know the consequences of your actions.
And perhaps that's one of the challenges we face today. It comes back to our conversation about AI. There is so little understanding in some respects of what's out there and what it's doing and what it can do for you. We need some better education.
Yes, and which thankfully you're doing fantastically. If you don't mind, I've got one more kind of historical question, but I do feel that it kind of adds to the technological context as well. You mentioned that the naval enigma of the Kriegsmarine was a lot more secure, or maybe it was more difficult to crack.
There's two aspects. One, right from the start of the war, it was clear that the Navy were much better at these human errors, i.e. not making them, than the Luftwaffe and the German army. So that was always more difficult. And then, of course, in 1942, they then increased the number of rotors. An Enigma machine has 3 rotors on it, the traditional Enigma machine, 3 rotors, and then the German military put more complications on it in terms of plug boards on the front to create more complication, and then the German Navy put 4 rotors in it rather than 3, which increases the number of permutations. So, and that was the challenge that they were dealing with in 42, and once they realised that was the case, and literally, they roll out 4 rotor Enigma and it sort of the break-ins drop off dramatically until they realise that's what's happening and find out, and then they get back into it. The challenges are just the same. It's just another multiplication by putting another rotor into it. So a combination of being better operators and then this 4 rotor Enigma machine coming in meant it went quiet for a degree during 42 and then back into it. beyond that.
Yeah. And the reason I'm kind of like digging a bit deeper, kind of probing into the enigma, is because we spoke as well about AI ethics. And I remember, working in several like AI-based startups, like one of the things is that you, for example, get a recommendation from an algorithm to do a certain action, but then the next thing is to actually take the action. So, for example, we used to predict whether industrial machines are going to break or not, but you can send an alert to the factory, but if they actually do something about it and prevent the eventual breakdown is a whole other story. And this is something that's a really kind of strong emotive aspect, I think, of Bletchley Park, is that, for example, if you do know that the Luftwaffe is going to bomb somewhere, or that there's going to be a convoy intercepted, how do you pick and choose who to let know and who to not let? What was the story?
Well, so there's quite a lot of mythology about this. And the Coventry one is the big one. For those who don't know, I mean, there was a big raid on Coventry, I think it was 1940, which did huge damage to the city of Coventry. And the story that has been around for many years is that Churchill knew this raid was coming and kept quiet about it to hide the fact that Britain was breaking into Enigma. That's not actually the case. I mean, what happened was they knew some big raids were coming off. They were breaking into a particular network, understood their raids coming off. Indeed, they had, from the intercepts, they had understanding that Germans had code names for certain cities. And Coventry happened to be Corn, K-O-R-N, and they knew a raid was coming up. They didn't know Corn was Coventry. And actually, on the day of the raid, they didn't break into that network. Because the Germans changed their cipher every day, you had to start from scratch every day breaking into this, and they didn't know. So they knew a raid was coming, knew a raid was coming on Corn, they didn't know which day it was coming, and it happened. So Churchill didn't sacrifice Coventry for that. However, what you do have to do is disguise your sources. And, in the 1941, in the early days of the Desert War, when Germans and Italians was working together, the codebreakers were breaking into the Italian cipher. They were using a machine called a Hagelin, which wasn't quite as good as the Enigma. And they knew when when convoys were going backwards and forwards from Italy across the Mediterranean. So to hide the fact that they were breaking into these, they would send a plane up, slow and low over the convoy, making sure it had been seen, so that when submarines or warships came in, an hour later, the convoy was saying, "Damn, we were spotted by that aeroplane," rather than the fact that actually they already knew what the convoy route was and where it was going.
Right.
So you have to disguise your source, source protection. But I'm not aware of any incident where any significant numbers of British or Allied lives were given up to hide Enigma. I mean, it was, and the other, come back to my point about the sort of all the networks. There were a huge number of networks that they were breaking into for all sorts of reasons. Whether it was the high level cipher with more complex machines, or whether it's just the fact that there were hundreds of networks going, and they can only ever break into tens of those networks on a daily basis. But the percentage they managed to get was sufficient to create an intelligence picture. I said earlier, was very rich, very detailed, and allowed those soldiers staying on them and doing their job to have a really good picture.
Yeah. What you just mentioned with the mythology surrounding Bletchley Park and a lot of the stories, I think what is really important in institutions like your own is that you digest history for people. So that history isn't just like, one big PR campaign, but you show and educate people through the lens of both technology, but also just the storytelling. And I'm curious, like, what your hopes are for Bletchley Park, for the next, this is a very visionary question, for the next 10 years, what do you really like to achieve, and where Bletchley Park's place in the modern world is as well?
Interesting question. I mean, one contextual piece is, and I said earlier, I'm a battlefield tour guide and historian. What we saw with the First World War was a huge rise up to the centenary. We had the last veteran, Harry Patch, dies a bit before that, but huge increase. And centenary seemed to have a resonance. People like those big dates. At the moment, we have a lot of World War II veterans still alive who are still engaging, who are still doing media stuff, who people are still seeing. like the First World War, the interpretation has changed over time. When I first went to battlefields of the First World War back in the sort of 1980s, people were interested in General Haig and the battle plans. Now they're interested in, what did my granddad do? Where did they go to the toilet? What did they eat? And those sort of practical stuff. And I think we're seeing a shift with the World War II veterans, from the big picture of Bletchley Park and its impact on the war to some of these lovely old ladies now who, what is it like to be there? Living in a Woburn Abbey or somebody's billet versus what it's like to work in your office space. And our exhibition we've just opened about called The Intelligence Factory, which is about the industrialisation, covers everything from the growth of the code breaking through what it was like to recruit, to train, to live, to work, and all those sort of bits and pieces. So there's a sort of changing narrative, and I think that will continue to increase. And the World War II centenary, I suspect, will get a similar sort of buzz and interest that the World War I centenary has. Now, the World War I centenary suddenly sort of dropped off, and we went into COVID after that. It's a little bit difficult to know, but I think there's a sort of, okay, we've got that. We've done the centenary now. Let's not forget about it, but let's just put it back into sort of, into context. And I think, so for the next to 2045, I think we've got a sort of a growing, changing, different focus, but actually still very much in focus view of Bletchley Park in the Second World War. Beyond that, I think, that's when we're looking, and I'm already getting my board to think strategically, so, okay, World War II centenary, but beyond that, it wouldn't surprise me that if, this might heresy some people, in, 50 years' time, if Bletchley Park is Alan Turing's Bletchley Park. Because, he is the poster boy, has been the poster boy, and not just for code breaking, but also his wider life. He's now on the £50 note in Britain. He was 3 or 4 years ago. He was voted by the general public the greatest Briton of the 20th century, etc. So that role of Bletchley Park as a birthplace. I'm very careful not saying the birthplace because there are a number of competitors all working in terms of modern computing, but certainly a birthplace of computing and those sort of things, I think is going to be important to the story. It doesn't take away from the fact that what went on at Bletchley Park in the Second World War, but as with any good museum, it's about context, it's about relevance, it's about saying why that story is important. What did it mean at the time? What does it mean now? And I think that's that's where I haven't got a crystal ball that's clear enough to understand. But I think certainly there's those links, and whether it is an intelligence, information, big data, whether it's computing science, AI, they all come out. And which one will coalesce around at that point, I don't know, or all of them potentially. There's the intelligence story, which we put at the heart of what we do because it's about producing war-wing intelligence, also has tentacles post Second World War. There's the Cold War, which is still at the moment
still going on,
quite quiet. Well, and keeps resurging, doesn't it? But actually, there's a whole raft of stuff there. Again, that coalesces around technology and intelligence. So I think there's stories for us to tell there, and in terms of visitor attraction, what is great is people love a good spy story. They love a good intelligence story. They love the espionage. People still come to Bletchley thinking they're getting a peer under the curtain and seeing something nobody else knows. And as to go back to sort of the core, I run a business as well as as a charity as well as a museum. We are a sustaining organisation. So having touch points on a story that is a little bit sort of under the curtain, a little bit sort of secret, makes it hugely attractive, and will hopefully continue to encourage visitors to come through the door for years to come.
Thank you so much, Iain. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, I trust that you had such a great time as I had. My historical tentacles are like wrapped all around this because I absolutely love it. And it's curious to see that really the history of humanity is also a history of privacy, of information, of having access to information, of kind of stratifying it between different groups depending on how you want that society to form, like going forwards. And so I think the story of Bletchley Park, especially being so close to the origins of modern computer science, artificial intelligence is such a vital one, and it's a beautiful, beautiful example. I might be very biased, but I really believe it, of the kind of blending of the past and the present and the future, and really creating the future with the stories of our heritage. It's been such an honor to have you here, Iain.
My pleasure.
Thank you for talking to us about it, and I can't wait for our conference, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll see you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.